Okay, so let's take a step back. So now you've got your corporation, probably in Delaware. You're going out to raise money, and you've issued, at least initially, common stock to the founders. And you're probably going to raise either a issue convertible debt, a SAFE, or possibly Series C stock to your investors. What do you have to do to make sure you're doing this in a legal and correct fashion? Going back to what I said is you're either going to have to register your securities or there needs to be an exemption. So you're never initially going to want to register your securities. One is extremely expensive, and two, it's going to be almost impossible. So the exemption that most young companies rely upon is a regulation, and this is federal securities laws. Remember, you have to comply with both federal and state. So let's tackle federal first. There's a regulation called Regulation D as in dog, Reg D, which was promulgated in, I think, 1982, and it's promulgated under the Securities Act of 1933. And what Reg D did is it created what's called it's a safe harbor that essentially says, if you comply with Reg D, then you can have comfort that your offering of securities to your investors is in fact exempt from registration. Under Regulation D, so just like every regulation, guess what we have? We have rules under the regulation. And the primary rules that young companies rely upon within Reg D, and again, we're talking about federal securities laws for the moment. I'll get to state laws in a second. The two main ones that they rely on are Rule 504 and Rule 506. And so sorry to hit you with all these rules, but this is an important point. Under Rule 504, what you can do is, and it's pretty interesting, in the past 30 days, there's been a huge change in amendments to Reg D in the rules. So this is new information that we now have that is becoming law. Under Rule 504, you can make offers to accredited and unaccredited investors, an unlimited number. That's pretty good. But you're capped on the amount of money you can raise under Rule 504. Back when I started practice, way back when, the cap was $1 million. The cap was increased to 5 million. I forget, don't hold me to this, maybe 5-7 years ago. The new amendments just increased the cap to 10 million. That's a big change. So I think you're going to see more people relying on 504 than they historically have. Why? Because you can raise a higher amount under the rule. The drawback to Rule 504 is a couple of things. Under Rule 504, there is not federal preemption. What that means is if you comply with Rule 504, you have a safe harbor from federal registration, but you do not have a exemption from state exemptions. You have to find a state exemption. So there is not federal preemption, meaning, hey, you just have to satisfy federal law. That can be very important. Why? Because in many states, there is a pre-offering filing that you have to make in the state in order to comply with the state exemption for Rule 504 type offerings. When I say that, that means you actually have to do, believe it or not, a filing with the state securities administrators in the states that you want to offer your securities in before you even make the offer. That's a pain in the rear because a lot of times you go, I don't know where I'm going to make the offer. I don't know where these people are located. You have to do more sort of digging and homework up front. So that's a hassle. And it's something, it's not exciting to do, but you have to do it in order to comply with state securities laws. Let's not lose the forest for the trees. Going back to Rule 504, which is a federal rule, the good news is, again, you can have an unlimited amount of unaccredited and accredited investors. You can now raise up to 10 million, but you have to also comply with state securities laws. The next rule that, in my experience, that I would say the vast majority of companies rely upon for their offering is Rule 506. Rule 506 allows you to raise an unlimited amount of capital. There isn't a cap like Rule 504, although Rule 504, as I mentioned, was recently increased to 10 million. 506, there is no cap. It's as much as you want to raise. However, in Rule 506, there are other limitations. Under Rule 506B, as in boy, you can have up to 35, go figure, 35 unaccredited investors. You can have an unlimited amount of accredited investors. Under Rule 506C, as in Charlie, you can have unlimited accredited investors. However, under 506C, as in Charlie, you cannot have unaccredited investors. So let's sort of break these two down because this is important. Under 506B, another difference between 506B and 506C, and 506C is a relatively new addition to Reg D. Under 506B, you cannot do what's called general solicitation. You cannot just go out and blast your offering to everybody, either on your website or to the public. That is not permissible. Under 506C, with certain protective measures that a company takes, you can do general solicitation. It's a big difference. Although I still don't see that many people using 506C as I thought initially there would be, but I think that has been changing, and I'll get to that in a minute when we talk about equity crowdfunding. But under 506B, as in boy, remember you can have 35 unaccredited. However, there's always a catch. If you have any unaccredited investors under 506B, you have to provide those unaccredited investors with a ton of information. It's called the informational requirements. They are onerous. It's a lot. It's almost like a mini registration. So most companies that rely on Rule 506 do not make offers to unaccredited investors. It's too much work, it's too costly, and quite honestly, and this is where there's been a bit of a push and a pull and a tug by the regulators. On one hand, regulators want to protect the small investor so they're not taken advantage of and they don't lose their money. Why? One, because the law assumes, maybe incorrectly, that they're less sophisticated and knowledgeable. That could be false, by the way, but that's generally what the law thinks. The other is, if you're an unaccredited investor, you don't have as much money to risk. If you lost your money, that is more difficult to recover from. So the law says, hey, under 506B, as in boy, if you offer to unaccredited investors, you have to provide them with a bushel full of information. However, keep in mind, this is interesting, under Rule 504, you do not have to meet the so-called informational requirements. When I say the informational requirements, it's very specific information set forth under a rule under Reg D as to what you have to provide. It is onerous. So most people just don't do it. However, again, the good news with 506 is you can raise an unlimited amount of funds.